Despite the WikiLeaks revelations being the big story this week, the grinding business of government does still go on, and the NBN is one of the key policies the Gillard government wants and needs to progress next year. In a former life, our next guest was a senior executive at Optus, pushing the value of very fast, high-speed broadband and the economic benefits it would bring Australia. Fast forward to now, and the dual first-class honours economics and law graduate is now the Liberal member for Bradfield and helping the coalition take the fight to the Gillard government against the NBN. He joins us now. Welcome, Paul Fletcher. Now, before we talk NBN, we've got to ask you about WikiLeaks, obviously. Now, I would guess you're a bit of a tech head. Do you support WikiLeaks' ability to get secret documents out to the world?
Well, I think there's a few points about what's happened with WikiLeaks. It does indicate that the ubiquity of technology that's used by everybody, including governments, makes it possible to download what I understand were, if reports to be believed, 250,000 cables. So there's a massive amount of data that's being captured electronically, and once it's captured it can be distributed very readily. There was a case a few years ago when Microsoft was sued on an antitrust basis in the US, and there was a huge amount of quite damning evidence that emerged, email traffic between senior Microsoft executives. At the time I remember thinking, well, if even Microsoft can't keep emails confidential once the email traffic has occurred, then I think everybody has to work on the basis that once it's said, it's recorded somewhere, and there's a risk that it will emerge.
Right, so you're saying the technology just allows you to do it, but do you support WikiLeaks' ability and what they've done so far in getting it out to the public?
Well, I have some serious concerns about what's been done here. Malcolm Turnbull made the point during the week that there's a mix of different material that's in what's been released. Some of it, as he wryly pointed out, is a penetrating glimpse of the obvious. The observation that Kevin Rudd is a control freak. Well, we really didn't need to have this great imbroglio regarding leaks to know that. But there is obviously, as many people have said, the risk of American supporters and informants around the world could have their lives at risk. We are talking about Australia's most important security alliance, and so that is of significant concern. And when Assange says, well, look, don't worry, I've made an assessment of what's risky and what's not, I don't think that assessment should be left in his hands.
Do you think the federal government has overreacted?
There certainly appears to have been some politics behind the scale of reaction. It's obviously a critical principle in our society that everybody is entitled to the presumption of innocence. So to leap in and to say that Assange or anybody else is a criminal without going through the proper process is not consistent with our own judicial system. But that being said, the politics of the Labor government's response appears to have been a big driver here, including perhaps a bit of a sense of embarrassment at what they thought might be disclosed.
Do you sit there and think, there but for the grace of God go any of us? I mean, you've said before, you now take it that anything you say could well be recorded and come back and hit you on the front pages.
Well, it is interesting. If you look at what the Australian media has chosen to cover most extensively this week, it has been questions that have a domestic political relevance, largely because they're embarrassing to some of the relevant individuals. But I think that everybody operating in public life today, everybody operating in business, everybody operating in any walk of life must prudently assume that digital technology means that just about everything you write or say is captured, and there's therefore a risk that it emerges. And I guess the serious point that a number of people have made here is if this undermines the capacity of diplomats to do their work, that is a problem. That needs to be weighed up against a range of other factors, but that's certainly a problem.
I wonder if we could just move on to the NBN. We've had a change of government in Victoria. We'll get a change of government almost certainly in New South Wales next March. So we'll have coalition governments in Sydney and Melbourne. How will that impinge on the NBN rollout? And as we get more of the NBN rollout, to what extent do you think that'll create problems for the Gillard government?
Well, it's curious, isn't it, that the NBN rollout is thought to rely, amongst other things, on state governments legislating to force an opt-out approach by customers. That's to say, state legislation which would require a customer to have the network connected unless they specifically say no. That is just one red flashing light which says there is something very wrong here. If this is a technology which apparently everybody is crying out for, but the Labor government's plans to make this thing work rely upon legislation effectively to compel people to take it, that seems like a very, very odd arrangement indeed.
You would be, no doubt, a strong advocate of fast broadband services, but what do you say is the best way for them to be delivered if it's not the NBN?
I am a strong advocate of improving Australia's broadband infrastructure, as is Malcolm Turnbull, our spokesman on communications and broadband, as is the Coalition. The point we make is this. The most effective way to upgrade Australia's broadband infrastructure is to work out the areas where the private sector will do that effectively and get the market set up so they have the right incentives to do that. And then equally, in the areas where the private sector is unlikely ever to build, the rural and remote areas in particular, then let's have public funding in those areas. And that's why we took a policy to the election of $6.3 billion, which in anybody's language is a lot of money. The politics of this issue has got really quite bizarre when people were saying, well, gee, $6.3 billion isn't very much. That is a lot of money, and that is how much we committed in the last election to spend on broadband, with a particular emphasis on the rural and remote areas.
How about the task that Tony Abbott gave Malcolm Turnbull to demolish the NBN? Do you support that task, or do you think that that's not a constructive way to go forward?
Well, clearly what Tony was saying was there is a model that's been put forward by Labor under which there will be a 100% government-owned company that we will invest now $35 billion into that, and that will be supported by legislation to give effect to that monopoly and, for example, make it harder for other companies to come in and build a competing network. So should we demolish that model? Absolutely. But does that mean we are opposed to improving Australia's broadband infrastructure? Absolutely not. You see, what Labor...
Don't you have to scrutinise it first to see if there are any merits within the model before just deciding to?
I think when you see an announcement to spend $43 billion with virtually no planning, and when we see all of the things that have emerged about this, on the one hand the claim that it's going to be a successful investment, but on the other hand we now learn that that means between 6 to 7% return, which no private sector investor would go near for an investment of this kind of risk. When you look at the fact that increasingly there is legislation proposed to give this company a monopoly to make it harder for new entrants to come in and build competing networks, we know more than enough to say this model is a bad model. So let's be clear. We in the Coalition are strong supporters of improving Australia's broadband infrastructure. We had a plan to spend $1 billion. The contracts were in place in 2007. Rural and regional Australians would have been getting wireless broadband today. The first thing Stephen Conroy did when he came in as Minister was cancel that.
You and Malcolm Turnbull, as you mentioned, you both speak this language. You're obviously advocates for technology. But certainly whatever Tony Abbott meant when he used those words, demolish the NBN, his strident language has made it appear as though he is not on board with you, hasn't he? Was that a mistake to use that language?
Not at all. Tony was making the powerful political point that the particular plan that Labor is prosecuting is a crazy plan.
But Paul Fletcher, would you accept that it had been endorsed by the electorate in both the 07 and then this year's election?
Well, let's just look at that. The plan that was supposedly endorsed in the 07 election was totally different to the one that Labor is now pursuing.
But it was still a national broadband network and a lot more investment than you're deciding to make.
To spend $4.7 billion, which in fact is less than we've committed to spend in 2010, but is around a tenth of what Labor's now proposing to spend. So, no, I don't accept for a second that the plan that Labor is taking forward now was the one that was taken forward in 2007. But the other thing is, it's absolutely our role to expose this to scrutiny and point out all of the serious flaws.
Sure. Now, you've argued repeatedly that the NBN is a very bad model. That's fine. What about the politics of this? How do you win the political argument? Because the NBN, to a certain extent, is a very popular concept with the people. So how do you win the argument?
Paul, that is a very fair point. And we need to be able to communicate the issues here in retail political terms. Issue number one, will people end up paying more for basic voice services? Certainly if you look at the McKinsey implementation study, that is what they recommended. So when the government comes knocking on your door to say, we're going to turn off your existing phone service, you've got to take a new one, if that means a higher voice price, that's a real problem. And there's a range of other retail political issues. Do people really want this, and how much are they going to have to pay for it?
Paul Fletcher, we are going to have to bring that to a close. Thank you so much for being our guest. And that's it for Australian Agenda. Matthew Franklin, thanks for joining us. Patricia Karvelas and Paul Kelly, thank you so much for being with us. That's it for Australian Agenda. Peter Van Onselen is back in the chair next Sunday. See you.